Hi, Juno News. Alexander Brown here, back for another episode of Not Sorry. Thrilled to be here. Thrilled to read all your comments. And while you are here, go to junonews.com/not sorry for 20% off. The situation in British Columbia, it continues to deteriorate. Was the road to hell paved with good intentions, or has this always been skullduggery of a sort? BC's Court of Appeals put down a precedent setting game changer this week with immediate effect. Every piece of legislation in BC must now seemingly be interpreted through the lens of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. This was previously viewed as a non binding instrument, a virtue signal, but look where it's gotten us. And this could have major ramifications for the rest of Canada. Surely we can't have the province run by 200 plus small governments that have no democratic relationship to 95% of BC citizens. The economy will be unworkable, the province ungovernable. Watch this urgent video from our guest today, friend of the show and leading BC common sense advocate and commentator, Caroline Elliott.
Another massive court ruling in BC, and this one could lead to an overhaul of much of our legal system. The BC Court of Appeal has drastically expanded the role of the courts to allow them to strike down BC laws for inconsistency with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as UNDRIP. Now, much of UNDRIP is inconsistent with many of BC's laws, and it's behind some of the most problematic policies in BC, like the secretive land agreements that threaten our democracy and our prosperity. This ruling means that the court has now given itself the ability to determine whether provincial laws align with UNDRIP, and where that isn't the case, the court will now get to decide what action is required. This undermines our elected government's ability to act in the public interest and could lead to some serious upheaval. For those working in the natural resource sector, this means more uncertainty, less investment, and more job losses. For all of us, that potential lost investment means lower revenues to fund the programs and services we rely on. It's another layer on top of an already unworkable situation in BC. Our government should never have adopted UNDRIP in the first place because it's fundamentally inconsistent with our existing laws and with our government's ability and duty to act in the public interest. The message I have for David Eby is clear. Repeal your UNDRIP legislation or resign.
Unworkable indeed. Through Trudeau-era sabotage, NDP malfeasance, or acquiescence, a province with a growing land use crisis where lenders are being denied loans under suddenly uncertain matters of property rights, it has now been pitched into even further crises. The BC Conservatives, at least, are finally stepping up. John Rustad has resigned, months too late, and the party, under interim leadership, is calling for an immediate recall of the legislature to repeal DRIPA, BC's now codified interpretation of UNDRIP, with immediate effect. It's a start, but British Columbians have been well and truly caught out by the NDP's work, primarily in secret and behind closed doors, that sought to limit the rights and bring their very fee simple, read property rights, into question over the past few years. If it can happen here, and I'm coming to you from the rainy BC Lower Mainland, along with my guest, it can happen anywhere. The virtue signals can come home to roost. And in breaking news, as I'm taping here, BC's 22nd Premier Duff Batulo was just removed from a bridge that carried his namesake for an Indigenous title the public cannot pronounce. Well-meaning actors on this file, who do exist, have been boxed out by profiteers, radicals, and even initially foreign-funded NGOs like Coastal First Nations, which we explored in my episode with Brian Lilly over the weekend, which is the name of an organization, not a legitimate assembly of Indigenous Canadian interests. It's a mess, and British Columbians now poll overwhelmingly in their concerns on this file. They're filling up assembly halls and events with major concerns about what this means for their land rights, water rights, air rights, even charter rights. There can't be two laws of the land, surely, and DRIPA is being positioned to supersede all else. That's not the Canada we can or should be. We can find a path to reconciliation that doesn't involve selling out our population and giving ourselves over to an industrial complex and dishonest far left radicals. Join us for this important chat, and first, a word from our sponsor.
This is a campaign called Unsmoke. Look, folks, it's time to modernize Canada's rules on nicotine. Alternatives to cigarettes, like heated tobacco vaping products and oral smokeless products, don't burn tobacco or produce smoke. They aren't risk-free, but the growing body of scientific evidence shows that they have the potential to be substantially less harmful than smoking. Despite this, Canadians are banned access to critical information and even some products. Nicotine pouches remain banned in convenience stores, and current laws ban communication about the risks of these products compared to cigarettes. It's unbelievable. The evidence is here. The tools exist. Canadians should have the freedom to know. You can learn more by visiting unsmoke.ca.
Our recurring guest and friend, Dr. Caroline Elliott, joins the show. Caroline's with the Aristotle Foundation Public Land Use Society. She's doing vitally important work in the Common Sense political stream in British Columbia. Caroline, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on again.
Now we have to stop meeting like this. I caught you at the sold-out public land use event last week in Vancouver, where you spoke to a full room of concerned British Columbians who are witnessing UNDRIP and DRIPA, its Canadian interpretation, bring into question their very rights, once thought to be inalienable. What's the latest? Tell our audience about this bombshell ruling, and why should we all be concerned?
Well, look, it's it's a complicated ruling. It's very technical. It can seem almost obscure in some ways. It relates to the consultation required in the Mineral Tenures Act. But the actual bigger question is I think probably more accessible to people and is more important in many ways. So when UNDRIP, or the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, was first brought into BC's laws, it was done through the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or DRIPA. It was unanimously accepted in the BC legislature, something I've always thought was a mistake. I don't think it should ever have been brought into BC law, primarily because it's inconsistent with many of BC's laws. Now, the way that I think they squared that circle was to say, look, this doesn't change BC laws. It just requires us to bring laws into alignment, kind of. And I think they maybe even thought as we see fit, right? Some wiggle room there where you really need the law to be the way it is today. This judicial ruling changes that. It actually makes it an issue for the courts to decide if laws are counter to what's in that UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a big problem. As I say, many BC laws are not consistent with UNDRIP. It also removes the ability of our elected decision makers to make those decisions about what to do when that's the case, and it puts it in the hands of the courts. So it's one of those really big, technical, but very important decisions coming down the pipe.
Yeah, and your breakdown of this ruling, I've been reading through your tweets. I'm gonna just nuke the name here. Gitsala. It highlights how UNDRIP now has, in Canada, DRIPA has immediate legal teeth in BC, and the concern would be, is this going to supersede our existing laws? Like, what do you see as the biggest risk to everyday peoples right now? Property rights, something like that.
Well, there's all kinds of things in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that are counter to BC laws, as I say. But some of them are things like, Article 26, where it talks about how Indigenous peoples have the rights to own and use, essentially, and the words are different, but effectively, the land by which they own by nature of it being their traditional territory. Well, how does that translate into BC laws when the traditional territories of British Columbia's 200 plus First Nations cover over 100% of the province due to overlapping claims between groups? How do you square that? Yeah. Something like Article 32, I believe, that talks about the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous groups before any projects can proceed within their lands. Okay, well, how do you square consent, or essentially like a veto-style decision-making power as it's been interpreted by BC in many agreements under UNDRIP or DRIPA? How do you square that with the ability of our elected decision makers being able to make decisions in the public interest? So something like the Site C project, which is a very necessary project, I think most people would agree, was opposed by certain First Nations. Could a project like Site C actually proceed in today's UNDRIP world, especially if we're being bound now by the courts to take that into account? So lots of different ramifications on that front.
Yeah, and expanding by the day. Look, Doctor, there's obviously a leadership question here. Lenders are already pulling back sort of post-Cowichan ruling, like in that Richmond building project. How is Eby's behind closed doors or cowardly hands-off approach to these court rulings already hitting families in the economy? And The BC Conservatives have finally moved on from John Rostead and are rallying strong into the holidays. What do you want to see from BC's leadership, like in this apparent vacuum over the last few months on this file?
Well, the BC Conservatives are absolutely right to have shifted significantly, I think, since John Rostead's departure in calling for an immediate repeal of DRIPA. That's, again, did I explain this? It's the legislation that puts UNDRIP into BC's laws. So that's the right call. I think that absolutely has to happen. It's an incredibly damaging framework in a country that actually already has really well-established constitutional rights that protect the rights of Indigenous peoples in various ways. Now, we're seeing huge uncertainty on the land base. We're seeing concern around lenders pulling out of deals in Richmond. We're seeing all kinds of title claims being made all around British Columbia on Vancouver Island, in the interior, in Coquitlam, you name it. So, and it's only going to keep happening. As I say to people all the time, the Cowichan title ruling was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something. It was the first of many. It actually wasn't even the first title declaration, but it was the first one over private property. So we have a very complex situation here. It does require really strong leadership. And what we've seen from the provincial government is a unwillingness to fight these claims adequately in court due to a directive issued by David Eby himself when he was Attorney General. It tied the BC lawyers' hands behind their back when they were making their arguments against some of these claims. That directive is still in place, by the way. He has not walked it back. So when we see these other claims being made, we should be very worried about the case that the government's putting forward. And there's a whole host of other issues, but I want to give you a chance to ask a question before I keep yakking.
No, that's why you're here. You're the expert in the room. And I imagine that has ramifications for the Memorandum of Understanding as well, which I know that for our listeners from coast to coast, probably particularly Alberta, they're thinking they can finally get a pipeline to the Pacific Northwest coast here. And what they're seeing is, wait, who's in charge? When it comes to these resource projects, there's even talk of, and great reporting recently on this Taltan gold mine, where there's these pre-vote payouts to alter the course of the project. I mean, how concerning is this for resource jobs and for the so-called sort of Team Canada recovery here?
Yeah, and I mean, in that case, with the big gold mine and the payouts, look, mining is a crucial industry for BC. It's so important, and what the government has done is it's walked into these kind of agreements with these different First Nations in the key critical mineral mining area of British Columbia, actually the size of England. Like, we're talking a large landmass here, and they're entering into these agreements that give all kinds of decision-making powers, including consent-based agreements. And again, as I said earlier, like, if consent is required, it means the nation's approval has to happen before a project can be developed and before permits are issued for that to happen. So when you enter into these kinds of agreements, you're placing essentially a veto power in the way that the BC government has interpreted these provisions in the hands of very small governments who do not necessarily share the same public interest mandate that the provincial government does. In fact, their mandate is to represent the interests of their members, not the interests of the broader public. That's their job and it's their duty, and they do it, I think, well in many cases. But here we are, right? So you have projects of national importance, provincial importance, whether it's a gold mine or a pipeline from Alberta to BC's coast. And then you have the government sitting there saying, however, we're going to place the ultimate decision in the hands of very small governments with very small populations that may not share that interest.
Yeah. Now, you have a major National Post feature that came out last week, and you nailed David Eby's so-called atonement project for Canada's supposed original sin. Can you unpack how this mindset is fueling these land use overhauls? Can you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, look, David Eby has surrounded himself with advisors who are on the reconciliation file, including his, I think the title is his special counsel on reconciliation, like a key person in the Premier's office who's earning a lot of money to advise the Premier on what direction he should be taking on all of these things. And if you actually go back and read what these guys have written, I would say it's actually very radical. It's revolutionary, the language they use. They talk about utter transformation of human affairs. They use words like rupture, and they use the word painful change, sacrifice. These are the things they're talking about, and they actually use the word original sin to describe, Canada's early beginnings and the basis of our entire nationhood, essentially. So, I think what's happening is a lot of these policies, like one of the most common questions I actually get asked when I speak with business groups or even campus clubs or wherever I speak, because I speak on this a lot lately. I get asked, like, why are they doing this though? Like, it's not even good for them politically. This just seems crazy. It's not good for the economy. It's not good for British Columbians. And the answer I give them is like, I think that they're really committed to this very radical agenda. And it almost sounds conspiracy theorist to talk about, but I encourage people to actually check out the article. I link to all the places where all of these things have been written, so you can see the words for yourself and make that determination on your own.
Yeah, and it does feel like a conspiracy theory. And yet I had Brian Lilly on the show over the weekend, and we went into like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund sort of degrowth playbook. And it sounds too crazy to believe, but like there is this whole outline of like how we're going to help these like Canadian NGOs that we're going to fund like just absolutely sabotage resource development and degrow the economy. And so it's the crazy is in the wool there. It's the dye is in the wool. Like there is, I think there are meaningful reconciliation efforts that have been largely boxed out in places by these radicals, by these groups, and by, unfortunately, the wrong leaders at the wrong time. Caroline, you've been sounding the alarm on these potential impacts for over 15 years. Like it was in your 2010 MA work. What I like looking for positives here. Like what recent consensus building on this file, feels validating to you now? Like what are you encouraged by when it comes to maybe the public's response to this?
Yeah, when I first started, like, it's true. I have been doing this for a long time, and I started kind of innocently enough poking around at the theory behind all of this back
Yeah.
in 2009, 2010 when I started my master's, and I wrote about it then, just saying like, okay, but how does this actually relate to like our liberal democratic principles, our democratic foundations, but also the public interest, prosperity, individual rights. Those kinds of things. And so that took me down an interesting rabbit hole that, I left when I finished my master's, I went and did some other things, and then ended up actually I worked on Site C for many years, as you may know, and had some experience of what this file looks like on the ground there. But and then even into my PhD. So not to kind of belabor that point, but I have been thinking about this for a very long time, and for a long time I was not the only one, but there were very few voices willing to speak up on this. And I think because even when you look at the unanimous adoption of UNDRIP in the BC legislature, there was a feel-good sense to all of this. A kind of like,
Yeah.
what's the harm? We're all trying to be good people. We all recognize, as I do, that there have been some real injustices in the past, and let's try to do what we can to make it right. And it just felt so good, I think, to a lot of people. But I kept thinking, yeah, but when you really get down to it, like, how do you square some of these really fundamental problems, like democratic rights for all British Columbians, like the public interest for all British Columbians? How do you square that with decision making being handed to very small groups that don't represent the public interest and that we have no role in electing as British Columbians? Like, you can't really do that. So that's why I was down that rabbit hole in the first place. It has been really good to see, even when I started speaking up on the provincial park closure at Joffrey Lakes, just a wider segment of voices saying, hey, that doesn't seem right. Like, BC's parks belong to all British Columbians, right? And then you move on to things like some of these land use agreements, and you move on to some of these court rulings. And I think what's happened is the public has just gradually, steadily become aware of the fact that, this probably isn't going to work. And so it has been validating, but it's also important, and I'm really pleased to see it.
Yeah, and I think it's good to find the positive there because, especially through your advocacy, your leadership here, this now rates as a majority concern on Canada's left coast, and it is a left coast, like the politically speaking, and the fact that that resonates even with a kind of virtue signaling voter base, I think is encouraging, and you're building momentum against these trends. I'm thankful that the BC Conservatives are getting it together because we have so many other domestic issues to solve for. As a working parent and active community member on the North Shore, what else rates for you as a pocketbook issue besides, just sounding the alarm on UNDRIP and DRIPA?
Yeah, and on that note, I will say it's before I get into your actual question, it's been amazing to me the lack of like partisan nature to concern on that reconciliation front and the direction that's been taken. I have people who I know vote Liberal. I have people I know who even vote NDP who say, things don't really seem like they're going on in the right direction on this. I have moms in North Vancouver coming up to me and saying, I agree with you, I'm worried.
I hear people
So
in Kitsilano at the coffee shops
yeah.
in Crunchy Granola Mom Kitsilano, like talking about your videos and like how they're worried about this stuff. So there is, that is penetrating the market.
Yeah, and I think that there's an understanding, like, this isn't just private property rights, although of course that's like a huge piece of it, but also
Yeah.
this is our economy. This is affordability in a big sense. But yeah, there's other issues that people are talking about as well. People are, I think, worried about the state of this economy in this province, which is partially due to, but not exclusively due to, the reconciliation file. But there's a whole host of other government policies that are standing in the way. You look
Yeah.
at those mill closures, right, where we lost, I think it's 350 jobs so far on the island. With the Crofton Mill shut down, we saw another one in 100 Mile House that's devastating. That's sending, it's a very small community up there. It's sending people to the food bank. It's awful to see. And, you know, there's so many pieces to this. There's the fact that 70,000 British Columbians left BC last year for other places in Canada where they see more opportunity. Like, we should be the place where people come for opportunity.
Yeah.
And instead, we're losing our brightest minds. So there's a whole bunch of concerns that people have across the spectrum, from economic to healthcare to everything else, to public safety to drug policy. It's hard to know where to begin, but this province is on the wrong track on a lot of files.
Yeah, I seemingly bucked that trend. I arrived here, I guess, to do some on the ground reporting on sheer calamity. And so, if you could pitch a common sense reform, say to balance reconciliation with a kind of tempering of what I call reconciliation incorporated, what would it look like to protect Indigenous rights and all British Columbians' rights and interests? Is it as simple as repealing DRIPA and starting over? Is it firming up treaties that are outstanding? Or is it just punting David Eby and the degrowth anti-civilizational left from office?
Well, certainly the last one is a must do, but it's not the only one. Punting David Eby and his crowd from office, as I think the public is going to be eager to do in the next election, is necessary to do the things that we need to do. So do we need to repeal DRIPA? Absolutely, we have to. It's a must do as well. But there's more. I mean, there's countless agreements that have been signed that very irresponsibly take away government's ability to act in the public interest. We need to walk those back to make sure that government can still make decisions in the public interest. And they're all over the province, these agreements, but you have to walk those back. I think we want to get back to, we have to accept the fact and be aware of the fact that we operate within a constitutional framework in Canada under Section 35, which guides this whole issue. And we need to, I think, get back to that, which required consultation consultation with affected Indigenous groups for projects that affect them, accommodation where necessary, and you have to prove in courts the depth of your consultation. Like, this is not just feel good stuff. It's meaningful. But at the end of the day, and the case law since 1982, when our Constitution was adopted, has been clear. Government needs to be able to make decisions in the public interest, and we have to get back to that. And I think we can.
Wise words from our resident BC political expert, Dr. Caroline Elliott. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.